Write in the comments where you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like. Some doors are locked for a reason. For decades, it was just a rumor whispered among collectors of government secrets and fringe historians. A single anomalous file tucked away in the deepest recesses of the National Archives, a place where inconvenient truths go to die. It wasn't just classified, it was condemned, marked with a stark red directive that went beyond any standard security protocol. Do not release. This is the story of that file, of the event it tried to erase, and of the town that was never the same. This is the story of Oakhaven. The breadcrumb trail that led to the Oakhaven file began not with a dramatic leak, but with a bureaucratic error. In 2019, a routine declassification of Cold War era documents by the National Security Archives contained an inventory manifest from a defunct agency, the Department of Special Phenomena, or DSP. The DSP was a short-lived, poorly funded entity that existed from 1975 to 1982, tasked with investigating domestic events that fell outside the purview of the military or traditional intelligence services. Most of its work involved debunking UFO sightings and investigating cattle mutilations. However, one line item on the manifest stood out to a handful of independent researchers. It read, File Ends 77-0. Subject, Oakhaven Acoustic and Luminous Event. Status, Permanent Containment. Directive, DNR was not a standard classification. It wasn't top secret, it wasn't SI. It was an anomaly in itself. It was an subsequent Freedom of Information Act requests for File Ends 70 were systematically denied, not with the usual blacked out pages, but with a blanket rejection citing a unique and rarely used exemption prejudicial to the continuity of public order. This response was a red flag of monumental proportions. It implied that the contents of the file were so paradigm-shifting or so disturbing that their release could, even decades later, cause societal instability. What could possibly have happened in a sleepy logging town in October of 1977 to warrant such a severe and enduring lockdown of information? The researchers began digging, not into the file they couldn't access, but into the town itself. They scoured digitized local newspaper archives, public records, and geological surveys from the period. What they found was a strange and unsettling void. For a 48-hour period from October 12th to October 14th, 1977, the Oakhaven Ledger, the town's small weekly paper, had no entry. The police blotter was empty. Jew phone records for the county showed a complete cessation of all inbound and outbound calls. It was as if for 2 full days, the town of Oakhaven simply ceased to exist in the official record. Before the silence, Oakhaven was the picture of rural American isolation. Nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains of the Pacific Northwest, it was a town of just over 800 souls, sustained primarily by the timber industry. Its connection to the outside world was a single, winding 2-lane highway that was often impassable in the winter. We managed to acquire a collection of digitized photographs from the Oakhaven Historical Society, taken in the summer of '77, just months before the event. They paint a picture of a town suspended in time. The images show a simple main street with a single traffic light, a diner called the Sawmill, a hardware store, a small cinema with Star Wars on the marquee, and a community bulletin board covered in flyers for a fall potluck. The people in these photos seem content, their faces etched with the quiet resilience of those who live far from the hustle of the modern world. They are miners, loggers, store owners, and their families. There is no hint of the strangeness to come. One key figure emerges from these records: Sheriff Wade Brody. A lifelong resident of Oakhaven, Brody was a no-nonsense lawman in his late 50s, more accustomed to dealing with bar fights and lost hikers than anything that could be described as a phenomenon. His daily logs, which were stored at the county seat and thus escaped the subsequent information lockdown, provide a crucial baseline. The weeks leading up to October 12th were unremarkable. Brody's entries detail a lost dog, a dispute between neighbors over a fence line, and a citation for a broken taillight. The final entry before the gap is on the evening of October 11th. It reads, 22:30. All quiet. Was clear skies, cold front moving in. After that, his logbook is blank for 2 full days. The next entry, dated October 14th, is written in a markedly different handshaker, less confident. It simply says, "Situation resolved by federal authorities. All inquiries to be directed to Department of Energy representative." There is no Department of Energy office within 300 miles of Oak Haven. This placid, almost idyllic backdrop is essential to understanding the sheer incongruity of what was about to unfold. The town was not a site for secret military tests. It had no major industrial plants, and it was geologically stable. It was, by all accounts, one of the most ordinary places in America, making the extraordinary nature of the impending event and the extreme measures taken to conceal it all the more baffling. First indication that something was wrong on the night of October 12th, 1977 came not from sight but from sound at approximately 9:42 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Residents reported hearing a low, pervasive hum. It wasn't a mechanical noise like a generator, nor was it a natural sound like wind. Multiple witnesses, whose accounts were later compiled from letters and suppressed interviews, described it in similar terms. A deep, resonant frequency that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a sound you felt in your teeth, in the marrow of your bones. Sheriff Brody's granddaughter, Sarah Jenkins, who now lives in Seattle, shared with us a hidden journal her grandfather kept. In an entry dated weeks after the event, he struggled to describe it. It wasn't loud, but it was total. It vibrated the coffee in my mug. The dog stopped barking, and the crickets went silent. The whole forest just held its breath. This acoustic anomaly was the prelude. The next phase, according to the few fragmented accounts that have surfaced, was a visual distortion. Streetlights and house lights began to flicker, not in the way of a failing power grid. One account, from a letter written by a teenager to his cousin a year later, describes looking out his window and seeing the neighbor's porch light seem to melt and stretch like taffy. He claimed the light bent at an impossible angle around the corner of the house before snapping back into place. Simultaneously, all broadcast signals, radio, and the 3 available television channels were replaced by a blanket of pure, static white noise. The phones went dead. This wasn't a simple power outage. Battery-powered radios were also affected, emitting only static. Oak Haven was completely and utterly isolated. The climax of the initial event occurred at precisely 9:47 p.m. The hum stopped. The lights went out, every single light. But it was more than a blackout. Residents described a darkness so profound it seemed to absorb all light and sound. It was an absolute, suffocating void. For approximately 3 minutes, Oak Haven was plunged into a sensory deprivation tank. There was no starlight, no moonlight, no sound, no wind. It was, as Sheriff Brody wrote in his journal, like the world had been turned off. When the lights and sound returned at 9:50 p.m., the world seemed normal again. The streetlights flickered back on. The crickets resumed their chirping and their chirp. The television showed the end of a commercial. For many, there was a collective sigh of relief, a nervous laugh, a dismissal of the event as the strangest power surge they had ever experienced. But for others, Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The most consistent and disturbing anomaly reported in the aftermath was related to time. Nearly every mechanical and electric clock in town, from wristwatches to grandfather clocks in the antique store to the clock on the town hall, had stopped at precisely 9:47 p.m. They did not restart. They remained frozen, a silent testament to the 3-minute void. Digital clocks, which were rare at the time but present in a few households, had reset to 12,000 and were blinking. People who tried to call out of town to report the incident found the lines still dead. Sheriff Brody, attempting to use his radio to contact the county dispatch, received only static. It was then that the first wave of panic began to set in. They were still cut off. The strangeness was not over. Perhaps the most compelling evidence from that night comes from a source that was, by its very nature, impartial. Dr. R.S. Thorne was a reclusive physicist and former university professor who had retired to a small, self-built observatory on a ridge overlooking Oak Haven. He was considered an eccentric by the townsfolk, but he was brilliant. His passion was the study of atmospheric and magnetic phenomena. On the night of October 12th, his equipment was running. Thorne died in 1985, but his research notes were preserved by the local university. While most are dense with equations, his logbook for that date is chillingly descriptive. He noted the initial low-frequency acoustic resonance, logging it at a steady 3 Hz, a frequency at the very low end of human hearing. He then documented a massive, localized spike in the geomagnetic field, an event with no corresponding solar flare activity. His magnetometer needle, he wrote, went off the scale. During the 3-minute void, all his instruments recorded absolutely nothing. Not a zero reading, but a null value, as if they were disconnected from reality itself. His final frantic note for that night, scrawled in the margins, reads, "The laws of physics were temporarily suspended. Space-time is malleable. They cannot be allowed to weaponize this." The morning of October 13th dawned on a town gripped by a quiet, anxious confusion. The power was on, but the phones remained dead. The single highway leading out of town was blocked, not by a landslide or a fallen tree, but by a military-style checkpoint that had seemingly appeared from nowhere overnight. 2 unmarked olive-drab trucks barred the road, and men in plain, dark uniforms with no insignia turned away anyone who tried to leave. They offered a simple, uninformative explanation: "There's been a chemical spill up the line. The road is closed for your safety." No one in town had heard of any spill. There were no chemical plants or transport routes for hazardous materials anywhere near Oak Haven. The cover story was thin, and everyone knew it. Around 8 a.m., a series of dark sedans and vans, also unmarked, rolled into town. Men in gray suits, described by witnesses as looking like G-men from the movies, began a systematic house-to-house canvass. They weren't aggressive, but their calm, methodical questioning was unnerving. They introduced themselves as representatives from the Department of Environmental Assessment. They carried clipboards and asked a specific, scripted set of questions. "Did you experience any unusual atmospheric phenomena last night? Did you notice any disruptions to your electrical service? Have you or your family experienced any nausea, disorientation, or memory loss?" They took detailed notes but offered no information. According to Sheriff Brody's journal, 2 of these men visited his office. They were polite but firm. They were not interested in his authority as sheriff. They informed him that a temporary federal jurisdiction was in effect due to a national security matter. They confiscated his radio, the station's logbook, and all incoming incident reports from the night before. When Brody protested, one of the men calmly stated, Sheriff, your cooperation will ensure the peace and stability of your town. Non-cooperation will have the opposite effect. The message was clear. The federal government, or some powerful shadowy arm of it, had taken control of Oakhaven. The residents were no longer citizens to be protected. They were variables in an experiment, witnesses to an event that had to be contained, controlled, and ultimately erased from history. The official story, when it was finally disseminated 2 days later, was a masterclass in bureaucratic misdirection. Small article, buried on page 7 of the regional newspaper, the Cascade Herald, attributed the Oakhaven incident to a rare weather phenomenon known as ball lightning, combined with the coincidental failure of a major telephone switching station. The article quoted a Dr. Martin Cross, an alleged atmospheric physicist from the Department of Energy, who explained that a large formation of ball lightning could theoretically generate a localized electromagnetic pulse, explaining the power and communication outages. It was a plausible, scientific-sounding explanation designed to satisfy casual curiosity and end all further inquiry. But for the people who were there, it was an insult to their intelligence. Ball lightning doesn't create a pervasive, bone-rattling hum for 5 minutes. It doesn't cause timepieces to freeze. It doesn't warrant a 2-day federal lockdown of an entire town. The Dr. Martin Cross quoted in the article, according to later research, has no academic or government record. He appears to have been a complete fabrication, a name created for a single press release. The agents of the DSB, what we now believe to be the Department of Special Phenomena, spent those 2 days not just managing the perimeter, but sanitizing the event. They visited Dr. Aris Thorne at his observatory. According to his journal, they confiscated several of his data tapes, telling him they were needed for a geomagnetic survey. They interviewed every man, woman, and child, carefully documenting their experiences while subtly suggesting alternative, more mundane explanations. Are you sure the hum wasn't just a transformer blowing? Perhaps you were disoriented from the sudden blackout and your memory is a little foggy. It was a campaign of psychological gaslighting on a municipal scale. Any physical evidence was meticulously collected. A farmer on the outskirts of town reported finding a strange, vitrified patch of ground in his field where the grass had been turned to black, glassy slag. The environmental assessors cordoned off the area, took soil samples, and by the next day had dug up the entire patch and replaced it with fresh sod. The incident was not just being covered up, it was being surgically excised from reality. By the morning of October 14th, the operation was complete. The unmarked vehicles, the men in suits, and the military checkpoint were gone, as if they had been a collective hallucination. The phone lines were working again. The road was open. A sense of normalcy was imposed on Oakhaven, but it was a fragile, superficial thing. The town was left with a shared trauma and an unspoken pact of silence. To talk about what really happened was to invite ridicule or, worse, attract the wrong kind of attention. The long-term effects on the community were profound and insidious. Oakhaven, once a tight-knit community, became a town of secrets. Neighbors who had once shared everything now avoided eye contact when the subject of the blackout was raised. An undercurrent of paranoia took root. People reported strange clicks on their phone lines and unfamiliar cars passing slowly through town. Within 5 years of the event, the demographics of Oakhaven began to shift dramatically. An unusual number of families who had lived there for generations quietly sold their homes and moved away. Sheriff Wade Brody retired a year later, citing health reasons. He passed away in 1989, taking his full story, save for the few cryptic entries in his hidden journal, to the grave. Dr. Aris Thorne became even more of a recluse, refusing all contact with the outside world until his death. Perhaps the most disturbing lingering effect was the cluster of medical anomalies that emerged in the subsequent decade. The study of public health records shows that Oak Haven and the surrounding county experienced a statistically significant spike in neurological disorders, particularly chronic migraines, vertigo, and a rare form of early-onset tinnitus. There was also an increase in certain types of aggressive cancers. While no official link was ever established, the correlation is hard to ignore for researchers examining the case today. The cover-up was successful, not because it was perfect, but because it was total. It left a vacuum, and into that vacuum flowed fear, uncertainty, and silence. The Oak Haven anomaly became a local ghost story, a piece of folklore whispered to children. The truth of the event was buried under the weight of a carefully constructed fiction and the collective trauma of a town that was told what they saw, heard, and felt did not happen. For over 40 years, the Oak Haven story remained dormant, a cold case with no files and no official witnesses. The breakthrough came from the declassification of the DSP manifest, which provided the first external, verifiable piece of evidence that something had happened. It gave researchers a name, Project Nightshade. Tucked away in the footnotes of a budgetary report for the DSP was a heavily redacted line item for Operation Nightshade, allocated significant funding for field containment and data sanitization. The dates of the project's active phase: September 1977 to January 1978. Oak Haven fell directly in the middle of that window. This discovery shifted the focus of the investigation. The event was no longer just an unexplained phenomenon. It was the subject of a specific, named and funded government operation. This raises a critical question. Was the DSP merely a cleanup crew sent in to contain a spontaneous event, or was Oak Haven the testing ground for something far more deliberate? Analysis of the partial documents related to Project Nightshade reveals a focus on non-lethal acoustic and electromagnetic deterrence. The project's stated goal was to develop technology capable of incapacitating enemy personnel and disabling electronic systems over a wide area without causing permanent damage. The language is vague and sanitized, but the parallels to the Oak Haven event are undeniable. The low-frequency hum, the electrical disruption, the sensory blackout, it all aligns with the theoretical application of such a weapon. This theory suggests that the Oak Haven anomaly was not an alien visitation or a natural event, but a secret military experiment gone horribly wrong. The technology was perhaps far more powerful or unstable than its creators anticipated. The 3-minute void and the temporal distortions might have been an unforeseen side effect, a catastrophic tearing of the local space-time fabric that the project's directors could neither explain nor control. The subsequent cover-up in this context was not just to hide a secret weapon, but to hide a monumental failure, a failure so profound that it touched upon the fundamental laws of physics. The men in gray suits weren't just silencing witnesses, they were burying their own terrifying mistake. The do not release stamp on the file wasn't just to protect national security. It was to prevent the scientists and military brass responsible from ever being held accountable for turning a town of 800 people into unwitting lab rats. While the failed experiment theory is compelling, it doesn't account for all the data, particularly the notes of Dr. Iris Thorne. Thorne was a brilliant physicist, and his observations point toward a phenomenon of a different order of magnitude. His logbook, which we were able to have analyzed by Dr. Evelyn Reed, a contemporary expert in theoretical physics, contains calculations that are deeply perplexing. Thorne wasn't just observing a powerful energy burst, he was attempting to model a localized gravitational anomaly. Dr. For Hensei High Reed explains, Thorne's equations are rudimentary by today's standards. He's describing what we would now call a transient chronoton field, a temporary, highly localized warp in the fabric of space-time. The energy required to generate such a field, even for 3 minutes over a small area, is astronomical. It's far beyond any projected capability of 1970s technology, or even frankly, our own. This leads to a second major theory. Oakhaven was not the site of a man-made experiment, but the site of a naturally occurring, albeit impossibly rare, physical event. Proponents of this theory point to subtle, geological, and astronomical data from the period. There was a minor, deep-focused seismic tremor recorded in the region hours before the event. Too small to be felt, but perhaps indicative of immense subterranean stress. Additionally, Oakhaven is situated on a confluence of geologic fault lines, and some have speculated that the immense pressure could create a piezoelectric effect on a massive scale, generating the initial electromagnetic phenomena. In this scenario, the DSP was not a cabal of guilty scientists, but a rapid response team, a kind of scientific fire brigade whose job was to study and conceal natural phenomena that defied our current understanding of the world. Perhaps such events happen more often than we think in remote, unpopulated areas. But the Oakhaven event was unique because it happened directly over a populated town. The cover-up then was not to hide a mistake, but to prevent mass panic. How would society react to the knowledge that the laws of physics are not as constant as we believe, that a patch of reality could simply turn off without warning? The Do Not Release Directive would be a measure to protect the public from a truth they are not ready to handle. The long-term health effects could even be explained as a result of exposure to this exotic radiation or gravitational distortion. This theory paints the government not as villains, but as reluctant guardians of a terrifying secret about the very nature of our universe. There is a third theory, one that is far more speculative, but which persists due to the sheer strangeness of the event. This is the visitor theory. It posits that the Oakhaven anomaly was neither man-made nor a natural occurrence, but was instead the result of contact with a non-human intelligence. The observed phenomena, the low-frequency hum, the electromagnetic disruption, the manipulation of light, and most importantly, the temporal distortion, are all staples of modern UFO lore. Proponents of this theory suggest that the 3-minute void was not a period of nothingness, but a period where the town and its inhabitants were subjected to something beyond our comprehension. Was it a scan, an observation, a form of communication? The analysis of Sheriff Brody's journal provides a sliver of potential evidence for this line of inquiry. In one of his last, most agitated entries, written months after the event, he describes a recurring nightmare. "I'm back in the dark," he writes, "but it's not empty. There's a pressure, a feeling of being looked at, not with eyes. It's a geometric feeling. A presence made of angles that don't fit." This is, of course, the subjective testimony of a traumatized man, not hard evidence. However, it's a detail that doesn't neatly fit into either the military experiment or natural phenomenon theories. If an extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional intelligence was involved, the government's response makes a different kind of sense. The DSP's mission would have been to manage the single greatest secret in human history. The lockdown, the gaslighting of witnesses, and the permanent classification of the file would be the logical, if ruthless, protocol for a confirmed contact event. The do not release stamp would be the most profound and necessary secret, keeping measure ever enacted. This theory also recontextualizes the mission of Project Nightshade. Perhaps the project wasn't about developing a new weapon, but about attempting to reverse engineer or replicate the effects observed at Oakhaven. The government might have captured a glimpse of a technology so advanced it was indistinguishable from magic, and Project Nightshade was their fumbling, primitive attempt to understand and control it. It's a theory built on speculation, but in a case so devoid of concrete answers, it remains on the table, a disquieting possibility that haunts the edges of the Oakhaven mystery. In our search for living witnesses, we were met with a wall of silence. Most of the residents from 1977 are either deceased or have moved away with no forwarding information. Those few we did manage to track down, now in their 70s and 80s, refused to speak on camera. One phone call with a man who was a teenager at the time ended abruptly. Before he hung up, he said only, "Some things are better left buried." We made our peace with it. This sentiment seems to be the lasting legacy of the DSP's psychological campaign. The fear they instilled was permanent. However, we did have a breakthrough with Sarah Jenkins, the granddaughter of Sheriff Wade Brody. In addition to his journal, she possessed a small box of his personal effects. Inside, beneath old photographs and service medals, was a single strange object, a small, smooth, dark stone about the size of a bird's egg. It was unusually heavy for its size and had a faint, almost imperceptible iridescence, according to a note tucked in the box, written in her grandfather's hand, found in Miller's Field, morning of the 13th. Still warm. This was the same field where the vitrified patch of ground was reportedly found and subsequently removed by the DS. The stone was likely a piece of whatever was left behind, a fragment that Sheriff Brody had secretly pocketed before the federal agents sanitized the scene. We had the object analyzed by a geology lab under the pretense that it was a meteorite fragment. The results were extraordinary. The object is not a stone. It is a manufactured alloy, composed of elements common to Earth, primarily iron, silicon, and carbon, but fused in a crystalline structure that geologists described as non-Euclidean and impossible to replicate under known terrestrial pressures or temperatures. Furthermore, the object emits a low-level but constant radiation signature that does not match any known isotope. It is a piece of exotic matter, a tangible artifact from the heart of the Oakhaven anomaly. This single object invalidates the official cover story of ball lightning completely. It casts serious doubt on the natural phenomenon theory, as such an object would not be a byproduct. It points squarely toward either an advanced, unknown human technology or something not of this world at all. It is the smoking gun that the men in gray suits missed. The existence of the artifact, what we now call the Oakhaven object, forces a re-evaluation of the entire event. If the DSP's primary mission was containment and sanitization, their failure to recover this object represents a significant breach of their own protocol. Did Sheriff Brody outsmart them? Or did they simply not know what to look for? This leads us down a darker path of inquiry. What if the object wasn't a byproduct of the event, but its cause? Consider this timeline. An unknown object or device activates, generating the acoustic, luminous, and temporal phenomena. It remains active for 5 minutes before culminating in a 3-minute period of peak operation, the void after which it deactivates, leaving behind residual energy and fragments like the one Brody found. This would frame the event as a technological one. The weapon test theory becomes stronger, but the nature of the technology is far more advanced than previously thought. This wasn't a simple electromagnetic pulse weapon. It was something that manipulates space-time. The term non-Euclidean, used by the lab to describe the object's crystalline structure, is key. In mathematics, non-Euclidean geometry describes curved space, the very foundation of Einstein's theory of relativity. An object with a physical structure based on these principles is, by definition, a piece of gravitational technology. Its purpose is unknown. Was it a power source, a drive system, a surveying instrument? Dr. Evelyn Reed, upon reviewing the lab report, offered a chilling hypothesis: an unshielded device that manipulates gravity, even on a local scale, would have devastating biological side effects. The radiation signature is one thing, But the warping of space itself would put immense stress on cellular structures. It could explain the long-term neurological and carcinogenic clusters observed in the population. The people of Oak Haven weren't just witnesses. Their bodies were subjected to forces they were never meant to endure. This paints the DSP's actions in a much more sinister light. Their house-to-house canvas, asking about nausea, disorientation, and memory loss, may not have been just for witness debriefing. It may have been a damage assessment, a cold, clinical effort to gather data on the human cost of their catastrophic failure. They weren't just covering up a secret. The official documentation, or what little of it exists publicly, is a study in deliberate obfuscation. File N77. O remains sealed, but related documents, declassified over the years, contain tantalizing clues. For example, a transportation manifest from a nearby Air Force base, dated October 14, 1977, lists a single cryptic shipment. The cargo is described only as geological survey equipment, Class 4. The destination, a secure research facility in the Nevada desert. The weight of the cargo is listed at 4.5 tons. This is an enormous amount for simple survey equipment. Is it possible this was the vitrified earth and other materials removed from the farmer's field in Oak Haven? Another document, a heavily redacted internal memo from the director of the DSP dated November 1977, speaks of the unforeseen biological consequences of the Nightshade event. It recommends the immediate implementation of a long-term clandestine public health monitoring program for the affected area. It explicitly states that the program must be conducted without the knowledge of the local population or authorities. This memo is a bombshell. It is official confirmation that the government knew about the potential health risks and chose to study the people of Oak Haven like specimens in a petri dish rather than warn or treat them. It transforms the narrative from one of secrecy to one of profound and criminal negligence. The redactions in these documents are as revealing as the text that remains. In the DSP memo, an entire paragraph is blacked out following the phrase, "the temporal component." Whatever the temporal component was, it was considered so sensitive that it remained classified even when the rest of the document was released. What happened to time in Oak Haven? The clock stopped, but was that all? Did some people experience missing time? Did others experience something even stranger? The silence of the surviving witnesses is telling. Perhaps the trauma they are guarding is not just the memory of a strange light and sound, but a memory of something far more personal and incomprehensible that occurred during those 3 minutes of darkness. The blacked-out ink of the government censor conceals a truth that, even now, they believe we cannot handle. Today, Oak Haven is a shadow of its former self. The timber industry collapsed in the 1990s, and the population has dwindled to less than 200. Main Street is lined with boarded-up storefronts. The diner, the cinema, the hardware store, all are gone, victims of economic decline and a lingering, unspoken malaise. It's a town that feels haunted, not by ghosts, but by a memory it's not allowed to acknowledge. For those investigating the anomaly, the town itself is the final piece of the puzzle. The landscape holds the scars, the people hold the trauma. We visited Oak Haven, speaking to some of the newer residents who have no knowledge of the 1970-77 event. They describe the town as unsettlingly quiet and speak of a strange energy in the surrounding woods. Are these just the projections of newcomers onto a struggling rural town, or is there some residual effect of the anomaly, a faint echo of the energy that was unleashed there? The ridge where Dr. Aris Thorne's observatory once stood is now overgrown, the structure itself having collapsed years ago, but the foundation remains. Using ground-penetrating radar, independent researchers have detected a large metallic object buried deep beneath the foundation, an object that was not there on geological surveys from the 1960s. Is this part of Thorne's own equipment? Or Is it something else, something he discovered, or something the DSP buried there to hide it? The questions multiply with every new discovery. The Oakhaven anomaly is no longer a simple cold case. It is a sprawling conspiracy, a scientific mystery, and a human tragedy. It is the story of a secret weapon, or a tear in the fabric of reality, or a visitor from another world. It is the story of a government that chose to sacrifice the health and sanity of its own citizens to protect a secret. The file marked "Do Not Release" is more than just a bureaucratic command. It is a tombstone for the truth. It is a monument to an event that officially never happened, but which unofficially destroyed a town, broke the laws of physics, and left behind a legacy of fear, sickness, and unanswered questions. Let us return to the artifact, the Oakhaven object. Its physical properties are the only solid, uncorrupted piece of data we have. Recent advancements in materials science have allowed for non-invasive analysis that was impossible even a decade ago. A new scan conducted specifically for this investigation revealed something astonishing about its internal structure. The object is not solid. It contains a complex, microscopic latticework described by the lab technician as being like a three-dimensional circuit board. It appears to be a piece of nanotechnology or something analogous to it, far beyond the capabilities of 1970s engineering. This finding severely weakens the natural phenomenon theory and makes the failed experiment theory almost untenable, unless a secret project was 50 years ahead of the known technological curve. The most profound discovery, however, relates to the object's constant, low-level energy emission. When this emission is plotted as a waveform, it is not random noise. It is a structured, complex signal. It's deeply layered with repeating patterns and a mathematical structure that is characteristic of a data transmission. We are not looking at a rock, a piece of shrapnel, or a power source. We are looking at a recording device or a transmitter. The artifact found by Sheriff Brody may be a piece of a larger device that was recording everything that happened during the anomaly. The energy it emits could be the remnant of that data, looping endlessly on a microscopic scale. Or more disturbingly, it could be a beacon, still faintly transmitting its location. This reframes the entire event once more. If the anomaly was an observation, this is the camera. If it was an experiment, this is the black box. The data it contains could be the key to understanding everything: the nature of the hum, the cause of the temporal distortion, the purpose of the 3-minute void. Unfortunately, the signal is so degraded and operates on such a bizarre physical level that we currently lack the technology to decode it. It is like finding a book written in a language that is not only unknown, but whose very physical principles are alien to us. The Oakhaven object is the ultimate black box. Or what happened that night, locked away in a format we cannot comprehend. It is both the most promising piece of evidence and the most frustrating dead end. Auf key and of boast, frustrating dead end, auf T into Bach, Mensch, Walft, The human element of the Oakhaven mystery is perhaps the most tragic and the most difficult to quantify. What is the psychological toll of experiencing a reality-bending event only to be told by your own government that it never happened? We found reference in the county archives to a local psychologist, Dr. Alan Finch, who practiced in a neighboring town. In the years after 1977, his caseload from Oakhaven residents increased by 300%. His notes, which were donated to a university library after his death, do not violate patient confidentiality, but do paint a grim picture of the town's collective mental state. He identifies a unique shared complex of symptoms he informally termed existential dislocation syndrome. Patients reported persistent feelings of unreality, as if they were living in a dream. Many had a recurring specific phobia, a fear of absolute silence and darkness. They would sleep with multiple lights on and radios playing, terrified of a return to the void. Several former residents described a strange form of memory anomaly. They didn't have amnesia, but rather a memory conflict. They had two sets of memories for the night of October 12th, the mundane, fabricated memory of a simple power outage that the DSP agents had suggested to them, and the terrifying visceral memory of the hum, the distorted light, and the silent darkness. These two memories existed in a state of cognitive dissonance, causing chronic anxiety and paranoia. They felt they couldn't trust their own minds. One anonymized case study is particularly heartbreaking. It describes a man, a logger with a family, who became obsessed with his clocks. He would spend hours every day checking and rechecking every timepiece in his house, terrified that time would stop again. His wife reported that he would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, "It's not 9:47. The DSP did not just cover up an event, they inflicted a deep, lasting psychological wound on an entire community. They weaponized uncertainty, turning people's own memories against them." The silence of the remaining survivors is not just born of fear of government reprisal, but perhaps of a deeper fear of confronting a memory that threatens their own sanity. They made their peace with the lie because the truth was simply too shattering to live with. Where does the investigation stand today? The official file, N77-0, remains under the Permanent Containment Directive. The government's position is that it does not exist. The Department of Special Phenomena was officially disbanded in 1982, its records absorbed and buried within the archives of larger, still operating intelligence agencies. Any attempt to follow the paper trail leads to a labyrinth of bureaucratic dead ends and national security exemptions. Operation Nightshade is a ghost, a name in a footnote with no official context. The town of Oak Haven continues its slow decline, the memory of 1977 fading from a suppressed trauma into a forgotten myth. The Oak Haven object, the only piece of physical evidence, sits in a secure, lead-lined case, its faint signal a constant, undecipherable whisper from the past. Yet, the story is not over. The digital age has provided new tools for investigation. Independent researchers continue to cross-reference declassified documents, searching for other mentions of the DSP or Project Nightshade. Satellite imaging and deep ground radar are being used to survey the area around Oak Haven, searching for other buried artifacts or geological anomalies. The science to analyze the Oak Haven object is advancing every year. What is indecipherable today might be unlocked tomorrow. The most powerful tool, however, is the dissemination of the story itself. As awareness of the Oak Haven anomaly grows, it increases the pressure on official sources. It may also encourage one of the few remaining witnesses, or perhaps a former agent of the DSP, now in old age and burdened by conscience, to come forward and break the decades-long silence. The truth is not lost, it is merely imprisoned. The file marked "Do Not Release" is a lock, but every story told, every piece of evidence shared is a key. The central question remains as stark and terrifying as it was in 1977. What happened in Oak Haven? The answer, it seems, is tied to a secret so fundamental that the authorities who guard it believe that its revelation would be more dangerous than the lie they have maintained for nearly half a century. They may be right, but the pursuit of truth carries its own moral imperative, a duty to the forgotten victims of Oak Haven and to our own understanding of the world we inhabit. To move forward, we must consider the convergence of the three dominant theories. It is possible that the truth is not one or the other, but a complex and disturbing synthesis of all three. Let's construct a hypothetical scenario based on this convergence. Imagine a naturally occurring transient chronoton field, the event proposed by the natural phenomenon theory. The government, through a secretive monitoring program, is aware that such events are possible, even if they cannot predict them. The DSP is their specialized unit, trained for this exact contingency. On October 12, 1977, their sensors detect the preliminaries. They deploy their team not just to study it, but to attempt to contain or influence it using experimental technology developed under Project Nightshade. This technology, based on acoustic resonance and electromagnetic fields, is their attempt to stabilize the anomaly. This action aligns with the failed experiment theory. However, their intervention has the opposite effect. Instead of stabilizing the field, their primitive technology interacts with it in an unforeseen way, amplifying it catastrophically. The hum, the light distortion, and the void are not the natural event itself, but the result of the natural event being poked by human technology. This is the visitor component. It may not be a spaceship, but an intelligence or a force from a reality that briefly intersected with our own. The geometric presence Sheriff Brody described in his nightmare. The Oakhaven object is a remnant of this interaction, not a piece of a ship, but a piece of our own reality, transformed by contact with another. This convergent theory is terrifying because it implies a chain reaction of cosmic proportions, triggered by human hubris. It would explain the government's absolute panic and the severity of the cover-up. They didn't just witness a natural event, and they didn't just have a weapon test go wrong. They accidentally opened a door to something they could not understand or control, and then they slammed. The do not release stamp is not just to hide their mistake or to prevent public panic about natural phenomena. It is to hide the fact that we are cosmic children playing with matches in a universe far more complex and dangerous than we can possibly imagine. It could have been a search for specific biological markers, for changes in the residents that went beyond sickness. Was the government tracking a change in their DNA, in their perception? Were they looking to see if the event had left a permanent habitable mark on the people it touched? Furthermore, if the anomaly was a natural phenomenon, even one triggered by human interference, there is the terrifying possibility that it could happen again. Is the government actively monitoring the Oakhaven region and other geologically similar areas for signs of a recurrence? Releasing the file would not just reveal a past event. It could compromise ongoing surveillance operations and alert the public to a threat they can do nothing about. This possibility recasts the do not release directive from a cover-up into a quarantine. The file is sealed because the phenomenon is not necessarily over. It could be dormant, a sleeping giant beneath the quiet hills of the Pacific Northwest. The final piece of this puzzle might be found in the modern-day actions of the agencies that inherited the DSP's portfolio. Are there unexplained budget allocations for geological monitoring in the region? Are there patterns of low-level seismic activity that are being quietly ignored in public reports? The truth of Oakhaven may not be buried in a dusty archive, but may be unfolding silently and invisibly all around us. What is the ration and function of the Oakhaven? A ration and function of the Oakhaven of Jade and the sanction of the Oakhaven of Juten? What does it leave such deep and locked of the silent darkness? What truly happened as a tune-in reminds and botches? Its silent darkness is shadow bait and beast. And what did it leave such deep and lost to crease the shrine burst? Is Sadu bead mocked of the violent marked of squash marked to these stumble paradigm stoots? It not be told the truth, the possible boat in cause of the mass of physics, wow